Well, today we have as a guest on the podcast the fantastic Franz Nicolay, who is here to talk about his really, really wonderful book, Band People, Life and Work in Popular Music, which is out now on University of Texas Press. So get it wherever you get books. Franz, thank you so much for coming on Money for Nothing. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for asking and having me.
So I really really loved this book because it explores a topic that I have experienced some and have thought about a lot from an angle that I had just never considered before. It's like you drew the lines of the like basically the entire scholarship, certainly on rock, I would say, maybe more generally on with a couple of exceptions on popular music. And you just like drew the lines somewhat differently. And as a result, you get an entirely different group of people that do and say different things and think different things and shed different light on all kinds of questions. So I guess maybe to start with, can you just tell us who are band people?
Yeah, band people are, I think maybe one way of answering that and why I've come to think of this book as maybe filling a gap is that we everyone has a sort of assumed understanding of what a rock band is or what a band is, but I'm not sure that anyone's ever that we've ever sat down and thought about what a weird institution it is. This combination of small business, chosen family, creative collaboration that we have this assumption as a culture since the mid 1960s that that a band is not only going to be a performing unit but also a creative entity, and for all kinds of reasons, the way that copyright laws um, were written in the period that you work on before in the 1800s, with the assumption that there is a separation between professional songwriters and professional performers, is in and the demands of publicity and celebrity culture in America map uncomfortably onto these expectations in terms of how the assumed collective work of a band gets credited, but also just the sort of the a lot of this is about external expectations from people who are music listeners, music fans, the way they think about what being in a band is like, the way they fantasize about what being in a band is like, and the actual sort of day to day and hour to hour experience of being in a working band. If you think of it as a workplace and you think of bandmates as workplace colleagues, as opposed to, sort of responsibility free artists living the dream.
And I think that thinking about bands as a social entity was so interesting, because you point out that it's not just a social entity; it's one that's made up over and over and over again, with shocking little oversight of any kind. And that's a little facetious, except for the fact I was thinking about, and you compare this to, let's say, big bands, which were a form of band, a major touring function in America, or country groups too, where,
Yes.
you would have kind of an apprenticeship system where anyone who's running a big band first was a member in a section and then probably is one of like the top lieutenants of the band leader, gets to see how a band is run, and then maybe eventually takes off on their own. And instead, rock bands are just like 17-year-olds who have a vague idea of how a rock band is supposed to work that then kind of recreates the social structure over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah. And I think that 17-year-old part is a big part of it. A lot of people end up committing their lives to this idea before they have a real sense of what it's going to mean 10 or 15 or 20 years down the line. I mean, big bands also big bands operated much more like a traditional workplace in that you had a boss, you had regular paychecks, you had rules and fines and but you also it operated in a much more traditional, you had bands like the Ellington Band or the Mingus ensembles where the leader was writing towards particular instrumentalists'
Right.
voices. But for the most part, the assumption was that these were modular, interchangeable parts, right? You lose a second trumpeter, you can hire another second trumpeter. You can call the union and get somebody who's roughly replacement level. Um,
Even a singer. I was reading some of the Sinatra bios, those two huge Sinatra bios, and like he leaves some big bands, and like he's the star, and they're still able to like slot in another singer because anyone should be able to play these parts, basically.
Sure, and because the leaders are were by and the stars were by and large not the singers, right?
Right.
The brand name is Dorsey. The brand name is, Ellington. The brand name is
Right.
not whoever happens to be singing for that group at the time. Like that's where that aspect of the singer and particularly the crooner becoming the star is really a product of the, as you probably know, of the recording ban, the ASCAP strike,
Right.
when instrumentalists couldn't record, but vocalists could, and so vocalists have the new music that's available to listen to, and they become stars. Um, but yeah, just in terms of workplace, it's a time. Also, big bands flourish in the Depression, right? So labor is cheap. Musicians are cheap. You can put together a big band for cheaper than you can in the post-war era, or even late in the war when there's gas rationing and there's rubber rationing, and tires are less available for your, and your core players have been drafted, and so you have to be getting by with these 16 and 17-year-olds who can't really play. It's much more of a traditional workplace boss staffing situation with a big band. And then a smaller jazz ensemble is much more modular, and roles are defined, but you can be a sideman on one record and then be the leader on the next record. It's just that's totally expected, that you're going to move more fluidly between these roles. And sometimes you're playing standards, sometimes you're playing originals. It's not as there aren't a ton of, obviously, with everyone can think of exceptions, but by and large, jazz ensembles aren't necessarily expected to be continuous over the life of a band leader.
Yeah.
And in fact, Nels Klein talks about in the book how the European jazz festivals that he's asked to go play are often disappointed if you come back year to year with the same group of people. Like they want changing lineups in a way that rock fans often rebel against. Again, with some examples that you can think of, rock fans get attached to certain lineups,
Yeah.
and which can prevent band leaders from making changes that they might otherwise make.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and it's interesting to think about the ways that recording functions along kind of like it seems like two lines in and kind of the increasing centrality of recording as like kind of the medium of record, literally the medium of record that starts to take place just around the time that you start getting these band people. And some of this, on one side, it seems like the sense that people have a sense of how this band is supposed to sound, increased copyright pushes towards smaller units that write their own songs, which also help to kind of create this idea that they should all be playing their own individual music, but at the same time starting to cut slowly but then quickly cut the ecosystem of live music down, so that not only are people maybe expecting bands to sound like bands, but also the sense that, oh, I can just go get another gig anywhere because there's 15 bars and every single one of them has live music every night in most American cities. That starts to go away, so musicians might need these bands more than they
Well,
did.
it's another sort of knock-on effect of that, and I think we can cite this change essentially with the Beatles, like so much else. This
Yeah.
this ex this expectation that a rock outfit, first of all, is a band, right? The first generation of rockers were solo artists. Your Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, uh, Elvis, Little Richard. Not bands, right? It's only with the British invasion that the sort of canonic rock act is a band with a band name. Um, and then
Right.
also it's with that generation that with the expectation is that it's a band that is writing their own music as well. right? Like some of those solo acts were songwriters, some of them were not, right? Some of them were Elvis is primarily performing other people's material. Chuck Berry's writing his own material. But the idea that a group of musicians is going to be a set group that is writing and arranging and performing their own material with a specific voice is new to that mid 1960s moment. The other thing that happens, I think, that you're talking about with recording and especially with well, let's just say just with recording, is that, and if you're thinking and to think about music and labor, is that the idea that rock and roll is a music that's driven by the recording instead of driven by live performance is at the root of the what what becomes a very permanent break between popular music and the musicians unions in America and in the British Isles, let's say the BMU and the AFM, right? Who, as trade unions are, what one of their core assumptions is protecting the jobs of
Yeah.
live
Yeah.
musicians. And so the major disputes that the AFM is involved in the first half of the 20th century are all around the replacement of live musicians by automated technology, right? So the replacement of bar musicians by jukeboxes, and then the big fights over the extent to which radio stations will be able to play pre-recorded music, records. And a similar thing happens in Britain because the BMU by the post-war era is so deeply
Right.
entwined with the BBC that the BBC is really unable to be and the BBC at that point is arguably um, the biggest single employer of musicians in world history with their various radio orchestras. And so in the 60s, when British kids are looking to play rock records, especially American rock records, like rock is only embryonically available, live rock in Britain. There's all these rules that the union
Yeah.
sort of
Right. Yeah.
structurally ends up in a reactionary position, right? So like protecting live dance bands, you get these sort of comic scenes at dance nights, at like youth dance nights, where the union rules require a live band to be there and records to be only played during the breaks. And so kids rush the floor in the 10-minute breaks between sets to dance to American rock and roll and then go get their drinks when the live band comes on to play. Similar things on the BBC, which leads to the creation of the offshore pirate radio stations that
Right.
that are operating outside of the rules but can play the music that people are looking to hear. That's a little bit of a tangent, but that the
No.
I don't think people always realize like the depth of the revolution of recorded music, or how gradually it happens.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean also another thing with the Beatles I think that's important is the increasingly canonical position of the album, that
Yeah.
right where you have extra space and context, and the creation of like an ideology that this is like capital A art instead of a series of 7-inch singles.
Right. That the expectation that the album is going to be a unified artistic statement, but that the album is also not necessarily a simple capturing of the live sound of the group, right? As
Right.
as overdubbing comes in and multi-tracking comes in, that you're making something that's distinct from what it sounds like to go see that band in a
Right.
club.
Right. So one of the things I think, thinking again about like bands and how they become these like fascinating, complicated cultural entities, is you also talk about, in a way that I had never thought of, about bands as having kind of an internal politics in a lot of complicated ways.
Mm-hmm.
But like really, I thought really usefully talking about the ways that they've got an internal politics that's related to but not reducible to money.
Mm-hmm. Here's another reason why I think this book is a little bit different, is that the most of the books that get written about rock bands are either by the musicians themselves. who have all sorts of, stances that they want to take vis-a-vis the bands that they've played with, the other musicians they've played with, or music journalists who don't always, who have different, I mean, the interactions that music journalists have with bands tend to be in the inflection points around a release date, right? The access is granted to bands, or the publicist sends out the email saying like such and such a band is open for business because journalistically, because they've got a record
Yeah.
coming out.
Certainly, I've never seen a description of like, oh, we get off tour and then so and so disappears, and that's part of our dynamic and a complicated one because
Right. So it's a lot of it is a lot of the stuff I'm interested in talking about in the book is what happens in all that other time, right? You
yeah,
put out a record every 3 years, or you go on tour, once or twice a year. But the act for any band that's more or less full time, there's going to be activity that's invisible to the public and invisible to journalists, and that constitutes the bulk of the time. And those
right,
relationships that are sorted out, that are not the relationships that are expressed in column inches, or clicks, or even on stage. It's the relationships that are sort of negotiated around who's in charge of the money and who's in charge of the credits and who hangs out with who once you get off stage, and who's booking the rental cars, and who's in touch with the management, and so on, like who is going to take what tier of
right,
interviewer, who's going to talk to the New York Times and who's going to talk to the freshman journalist from the University of Kansas.
right, right. No, no, no. I was thinking about like the only band I've ever read that gets that kind of attention on that broader thing is maybe partially because they were kind of always on was the Grateful Dead, where like specific roadies and like when they hold different positions in the Dead organization is like understood as influencing the band this way or that way, that there's this like broader social world around them all the time, but also they were always on and don't have, almost by definition, down periods.
Yeah, and also because they were such a, I mean, I'm not a Dead expert, but my understanding is that they had a self-contained corporate organization in a way that other bands of their generation didn't, in terms of like they were trying to run their touring. Is that right? That they were kind of.
Yeah, no, no, no. They have a kind of whole complicated. Yeah, they're fully independent for a minute in the '70s. Yeah, they've
That's what I
got.
mean. Like the Rolling Stones obviously are a corporate entity, but they have a lot of people work that are external to the band working for them, in the way that I think the Dead had this independent thing where everyone was, there was a huge staff that only worked for the Dead. And
Yeah,
so
right,
so
for
their
sure.
fans, especially because of the immersiveness of the fandom, and the fact that fans were not just coming to see the Dead once a year when the Dead came to them. There's probably more of a
Right.
general awareness of the infrastructure and the hierarchy of the infrastructure among the general fan base. That's my
Yeah,
guess.
no, I think that's probably right. I mean, so thinking though again about kind of like the politics of these bands. I mean, one of the things I thought was really interesting was I think there's often like a rote assumption that like the ideal form of a band should be a democracy, or it's kind of a solo project with
Mhm.
people like hired more or less levels of hired guns. If you had to, I think, like stop a person on the street and say like, how do bands function? Um, and what you get into in all of these complicated, nuanced ways is that there isn't like one right way to do this, that there's not one right way to be, there's not one way to be democratic, that actually that's a vast, oversimplification. There's many ways to equitably divide up labor, and that has is political and it's artistic and it's just an incredibly complicated issue.
Yeah. Carl Wilson, the critic, has started using the term bandonym to 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 refer to those individual songwriters who, for whatever private reasons, prefer to present themselves as a band.
Hmm.
So like Waxahachie is Katie Crutchfield, or Jeff Tweedy
Right.
is Wilco, that sort of thing. And I I haven't looked deeply and sort of um, statistically into this, but my sense is that that more that you're much more likely there's more of those kinds of bands, quote unquote, in the emergent indie rock, guitar forward
Yeah,
music than there are bands proper in the sense that I'm talking about. And I think, there's a couple reasons for that. One of which is that home production technology has become so good and so affordable that it's just so
right.
much logistically easier to just sort of make a record yourself. And then if you're lucky enough to have the the demand for a tour, you can just put a group together and call it whatever you want. Um, as opposed to finding a bunch of collaborators with whom you have a creative affinity and renting rehearsal space and schlepping the gear around. Like you can just make a record yourself and call it something. But also, that's the sort of as Liz Pelly's new book is very good about showing the way that the streaming economy likes to present the kind of musician that is best positioned to take advantage of it. It's never about a band. It's always about an entrepreneurial, bootstrapping solo musician who can be constantly churning out new material and paying close attention to the metrics of what gets engagement in a way that a band just isn't just really nimble enough or equipped to do. Um, I think that's a little bit
Yeah, I
off the
mean,
topic of your actual question.
no, 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 no. It's interesting, and it's something I was thinking about because I think you're broadly right. The big exception, I would say, maybe, um, would be like hardcore and metal, with where they I think there are still. I mean, there definitely are like projects that are run mostly someone solo, and then the rest of the band. Is abandonym, I believe is the the word you used. But I think there are maybe there are a lot of like in hardcore and metal like more traditional style bands, and for one, I wonder if that's in metal like something about like the technical difficulty, especially in like certain kinds of metal, is just like requires people to be contributing in a way that resembles more traditional bands. And the other one might be just the touring, that a lot of those bands tour a lot, especially like maybe hardcore bands, where it's hard to be in a van with four other people for that long and not have something happen.
Yeah, I mean, metal. I guess I would try to separate those. And I'm not like an expert in deep in even. I'm thinking of something like liturgy though as like abandon,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's
Oh yeah,
the
totally.
Hunt Hendricks. But hardcore is also so much about the politics of hardcore are so much about community and like the communal experience. And historically, of course, in this sort of homoerotic male bonding gang style
Yeah,
experience,
right.
that I think to have like a solo hardcore act might. Although, again, like you look at some of these hardcore brand names and they do cycle through a lot of rhythm sections over the course of a thing. So
Black Flag. Yeah, no, right.
yeah, yeah, Black Flag, right, is who, is function it right. That's abandon him if there ever was one. I'm just trying out this new word because I just read it in Carl's newsletter and I was like, there's a word for that. Great. I've been trying to talk about this concept. um, yeah, I mean, what was the original question? It was something about like the political organizations of bands. And in the book, I broadly group it into three categories of monarchy, democracy, and aristocracy, right? Aristocracy being like the Mick and Keith
Right.
version, where you have, a pair of people who are running the show. Um, and yeah, I think nobody wants to come down on a like here's the one way that's best to do it. Obviously these things are going to sort themselves out. It depends on people's expectations and people's energy levels and um, people's ages a lot. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
one of the things a lot of people said was like democracy would be a great ideal if it ever worked. If you have to, it's only for that's like that's a young person's game. Like your first band should be a democracy probably, and then you
It's
sort
like
of if you stick with it and become a more or less professional band person, then you're gonna just sort of end up in situations which are a little more regimented and um, you don't have the energy to like fight for your space, or you don't have the desire to do that in all kinds of different ways as you become a more veteran band person. Um, I mean, I think the one thing where, regardless of how decisions get made,
Hmm.
right? And so there's a lot of external, again, like a lot of external pressures on this sort of thing. So one of the things is, how do you talk to management if you have management, or how do you talk to a booking agent if you have a booking agent? It's often much easier for management or booking or journalists to not try to talk to everyone at
Right.
once, right? Just for basic logistical reasons, right? Like, how hard is it to schedule a Zoom call for six people? Maybe you can just talk to one, you can have a band meeting, and then someone can be deputized to call the booking agent and tell them what. But then, do we say yes to this? You have to wait for everyone to weigh in. Like, it's just much more streamlined if there's one or two people who are making a lot of those kinds of decisions. Um, from a from a music journalism point of view, you want to put a band on the cover of a magazine. Graphically, it's easier if it's only one or two faces instead of six
Right.
faces. You have to get everyone to the photo shoot. You have to take, how many photos do you have to take to make sure nobody has their eyes closed in a weird way? Like, there's just all kinds of ways in which it's easier not to deal with everybody.
Right.
Um, but then even the bands that are fiercely democratic, Joe Lally from Fugazi talks about this in the book. You know, the most one of the most famously democratic bands in the history of rock bands. But who's the person that from Fugazi that everyone knows? Ian MacKaye. How many people know the names of the other people in Fugazi who are not, deeply invested music fans,
Right.
right? Like, so there's an emergent star system just based on for these reasons that are totally independent of the ideals and the politics that are internal to the band.
But it also, I mean, I think that it gets at, the book does such a good job of getting at, like, it's complicated because even if you have, I mean, I think Fugazi is a really bad example because I really do believe that all the members of that band like fundamentally shape how that band, like, change any single one of them,
Yes.
totally different band. Um, but
Yeah.
but
And they believe that too.
but there are bands where different people are influencing the final sound in, well, different amounts in different ways, and how you think
Yes.
about the reality of the fact that different people are influencing the final sound in different ways is complicated and fraught, and at some points even like like quite psychoanalytic. Like, you have this part where you're talking about, like, how, when is it best to have the fight and when is it best to not talk about it, and I'm just like, oh, it's just, these are just band members in therapy, like, figuring it out. It's really just, I felt like the non-platonicness of it, like, there isn't a right way to do this, and there's so many specific situations, was so refreshing to think about, and to think about really seriously and think about
Yes. And
critically.
I mean, there's so many ways I could answer that. Things that made me think of talking about. The one is the members, the band members who you don't always expect, who turn out to be core to a band's sound and chemistry. And again, sometimes that's internally, and then sometimes that's from the fan side, right? There are band members,
Hmm.
and everyone can think of their personal example, who are fan favorites for, maybe they're very accessible off stage, maybe they're big on social media, maybe they're just really enthusiastic and charismatic on stage, but who are not core, crucially, to the band's sound. For me, I think of someone like, and
Yeah.
this is like an outdated example now, but someone like Amy Klein, when Titus Andronicus first came on the scene. Like, she was,
Hmm.
Titus Andronicus is really abandoned him. It's a Patrick Stickles project, but everyone loved this woman, Amy. And she left the band to do other stuff, and it didn't change the sound of the band whatsoever. But it was enough of a disappointment that
Yeah.
people published stories about it. Like,
I
oh no,
remember. Yeah.
Amy's leaving. Yeah. Um, on the other hand, think about someone like Bill Berry in REM, Like, how
Right.
crucial do you think of the drumming to the sound of REM in terms of the hierarchy of those four members? I would, offhand, I would say fourth, right? He's not the
Right.
singer and lyricist. Peter Buck's guitar is so distinctive. Mike Mills brings these harmonies, and he's the keyboardist, and he's got these melodic bass lines. But it's when Bill Berry leaves the band that I
Yeah.
think the conventional wisdom has it is that they were just never the same after that. That is the moment at which the commercial decline begins, and then culminates with the breaking up of the band. And so there's something internal to the chemistry of the band that you can't predict necessarily.
Yeah. No, totally. And it's also, I mean, I think there's also the music element of it too. I mean, I was thinking you have an example in here about like no one knows the drummer from AC/DC, except for the fact that it
Yeah.
is empirically proven that he is more important than the lead singer. They got two lead singers, they had one drummer, and
Yes. Yeah, good point. Yeah. I mean, the other thing that happens, I think there, the one to talk about, you mentioned the term, so you mentioned in passing something about group therapy. And there's a way in which, you know, the fantasy of how rock and roll bands operate is fundamentally in conflict with stability and longevity,
mm-hmm.
right? The bands that have um, but also the fantasy of how a rock band operates is outdated in the 21st century, right? Because this sense of transgression and irresponsibility, like that you don't have not irresponsibility necessarily, but responsive freedom from
Right, right,
responsibility and all the other things of the mythology of rock and roll are predicated in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s in a way that is obvious, but maybe it doesn't always get said on vast pools of money,
yep, yep. If you're gonna trash a
whether
hotel
extant
room, like,
or assumed.
yeah,
And once that money disappears in the post Napster and then in the streaming age, your rock bands today are responsible small businesses for the most part. And they're people who are, especially now that guitar. If I think I can safely generalize to say most of the people who are in the band business are middle class, college educated, you know, have grown up in sort of educated, therapeutic,
right,
right? Like these are people who are comfortable with having these conversations, I think, in a way that the first couple decades of rock bands weren't necessarily. One of the bands that I'll say there's no consensus on the political organization. What's a good political organization for bands? But I do think one of my takeaways is that the more you can democratize the songwriting credits, the greater the longevity and health of the band is going to be. And this is something, speaking of REM, I reviewed that REM book that just came out for the Wall Street Journal, and Peter Buck talks about how he was a devoted reader of rock biographies as a young person, and he just saw that publishing was one of these recurrent problems that broke bands up, and he was like, this seems like such an obvious problem, and there's such an easy way to avoid it, which is that we'll just share the publishing. And the bands that do that loom large in band people's imaginations: REM, U2, Radiohead, and they're the ones, not for nothing, they have these decades long career with a notable lack of acrimony because everyone got rich at the same time because they had those conversations before um, before there was money at stake. And REM is also someone that um, all of their early collaborators really comment on how like they're respectful, they're polite, they listen to each other. They're not. It's and and everyone. It's so funny to read because everyone's like, these freaks, these absolute lunatics, they're just nice to each other. We've never seen anything like it. you know that's all. Maybe that's all it takes. Like you can have any political organization as long as you're willing to have like mature conversations with each other. And maybe mature is the issue, right? If you're talking about bands that form when they're 18, 19 years old.
Yeah. I mean, it's also interesting kind of expanding out, and a bunch of the book is about this, is expanding out from people who are, members of, like, core members of longstanding bands to this broader group of people who, have reputations of independent careers and kind of move between acts. In sometimes we'll be we'll be a member of an act for a while, maybe, but have people who know them, and I mean, one of the things you talk a little bit about is the ways in which, and I think do a really good job of articulating how focusing on these people pushes back against a lot of this kind of like implicit capital R romanticism that is built into rock music, kind of both at the ideological level, but then also in the nuts and bolts legal level. Like,
Yeah, because you do have these journeymen, and some of them are quite high profile. Like there's not necessarily a distinction between being a jobbing support musician and being sort of like fame adjacent in the traditional way. Like people know who John Worster is. People know who Jason Narducci is. People know who Janet Weiss is. But again, like these are people who are moving from job to job in the way that you would move from job to job, and most of them get start out in a band that it's like as a core member of a band that achieves some sort of profile, but maybe that band stops operation for whatever reason, and you've got a reputation, so you start, like any freelance worker, you move from job to job and boss from boss, and some of these relationships can be quite lengthy.
yeah, no, and thinking about like how do we, it challenges like how, I mean, you talk a lot about like how far, if we're thinking about creativity, it requires like a much more like ecosystem vision of what human creativity and what human artistry looks like. Because it's, I mean, like I saw, for instance, the Janet Weiss, I saw that lineup of the Jicks like however many years ago, some shocking number of years ago, where it was like, this is clearly Stephen Malcolmus's band, but there's like this incredible drummer who is clearly having part of a musical conversation on stage, and and how far out does that go? Like, you can have a sound, right? Like, there's this larger group of people who are part of creativity in ways that don't necessarily get captured in a vision of the kind of understanding of songwriting that's determined by American copyright law, for example.
Sure. I mean, this is the Howard Becker book, right? Art Worlds, where he's talking about like the vast pyramid of support personnel that it takes to create an artwork. Whether that's Leonardo da Vinci's studio, or whether that's all the people in the end credits of a film, or whether that's, as Flaubert credited the guy who brought him his coffee at 5:30 in the morning as a participant in the creating of his novels. And some of these, in the movie business, all the gaffers and cinematographers and best boy and grips, they're credited, they're unionized, they have a piece in the residuals, like they're part of the infrastructure in a way that the music business is not necessarily, because it's not a closed shop in the way Hollywood is. It was for various periods and in various cities, but it's much harder. I mean, just try to find album credits on a streaming service to find out who even recorded a record, much less who played on it. Can be, is quite difficult.
Which, I mean, I'm increasingly convinced is a deliberate ideological move, which is a total sidebar. But like Liz,
well, I totally agree. Both from the question of encouraging solo entrepreneurs, but also the more you remove human names from a project, the more you can quietly replace it with non-human created product,
right?
Without people noticing, which is not for big name artists, but for certainly the mood playlists is a core Spotify policy.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe to start wrapping this up, one of the things that's really interesting about this book, and you say this in the introduction and kind of again towards the end, is the ways that this is like a portrait of band people in a very specific moment of time, um, like a specific set of generations of band people. We've talked a little bit about how um, earlier moments, how band people kind of functioned differently and operated differently. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting that I hadn't really thought that much about was kind of the changes that you get towards the end of this era. And in particular, you write about kind of declining union power, not in the 40s or 50s, but like in the late 90s, and how that starts to remake, and kind of how this generalized downward pressure starts to remake the lives of a lot of these folks, such that maybe you get the kind of more solo artist more solo artist organized industry structure that defines contemporary indie rock for sure.
Yeah, so the generation, how I broadly define it in the introduction, is basically from that 80s DIY movement up through the pandemic. And I frame it like that because I'm saying, you know, bands in the 60s and in the first 15 years after the Beatles, let's say, right, are
Mm-hmm.
are not doing, there's not an independent circuit. Like you're either latched onto the music, the industry has picked you up and brought you into its conveyor belt, or you're just playing at home
Right.
in rock, right? So there's independent circuits, vaudeville, there's you can be on the Keith circuit, or you can be you can be traveling on an independent, whatever carnival circuit. R&B bands are traveling on the Chitlin circuits. The big bands are traveling in a way that we would recognize as DIY, get in the van kind of touring. But for rock bands, I really think that that only becomes a widespread phenomenon in the early 80s. And then become,
That's really.
do you disagree?
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
willing
I'm
to
just
take
thinking.
pushback.
Sorry. Well, I was just no. I was just thinking about like, um, what I know about like certain dense urban scenes that didn't produce much
Hmm.
beyond like Boston, right? Where like there aren't that there's despite the name the band Boston, there aren't that many, and I guess the Cars right around the late 70s 80s. There's a lot of rock bands in Boston, and not that it felt like that's one of the things where every once in a while I'll find like in bargain bins like compilations of Boston rock music where like clearly they're playing and making records and never quite breaking out. And I didn't know if how you thought about like some of the regional scenes that maybe aren't quite hitting the record industry, but maybe are making a decent living in pre-gentrified times, in more local
I guess I
scenes.
think in general, if you're a regional indie rock band and the kind that I'm talking about, you probably weren't making a living. As a band person, you probably were working at the
Sure.
coffee shop or the record shop, and you were playing a couple times a month
Yeah.
locally.
Yeah.
But to be
Yeah. No,
a
that makes
to
sense.
be making to be supporting yourself as a band person, you probably had to be touring. And that meant in the 80s, like creating and then interfacing with the the book your own fucking life circuit, and then the sort of legacy clubs that remain from that circuit into the 90s and the first couple decades here. Um, and then I sort of close it off after the pandemic because of all the documented troubles that people are having with touring, because touring was so premised on being financed by being able to sell CDs and records, and 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 that is
Right.
the disappearance of that is a huge merch problem in terms of funding the touring, and also the move into home recording in the ways we already talked about. Um, in terms of interfacing with the musicians union, this is something I'm writing about right now, so I could talk for another 45 minutes. uh, but I'm interested, you know because of the pandemic era. I think in the pandemic era, musicians became like there's a there's a new interest in the idea of cultural labor, I think, generally, right? You're getting
Mm-hmm.
websites, unionizing and whatever. Um, and I think musicians became newly indie rock, let's say. That's roughly what we're talking about. Musicians became newly aware of themselves as laborers as they were trying to organize to um, get government assistance in the pandemic, let's say. To like you have to be able to define
Sure.
yourself
Yeah.
suddenly as a freelance worker and be able to say in all these sort of official ways, who you work for and how much you make. Um,
Right.
and you get the creation of some of these smaller, union-like movements. The one that's most visible on social media is UMA, the I forget, they were originally calling themselves the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers, and then they realized they
Allied workers.
couldn't use
Yeah.
the term union for legal reasons, technical reasons. Um, so now I
Oh,
think
I didn't realize
I
that.
think
I
they're
didn't know there was a
united.
name change.
Um, so there's like an energy, but also a naivete there, and like a real,
Right.
focus on social media activism instead of organizing in a traditional trade union kind of way, or even so you get there's this energy around music labor, and there's these legacy trade unions which have the institutional advantages, the ability to negotiate on the high corporate and governmental level, but also this very fossilized set of interests around easily unionizable situations like theaters and orchestras and television and so on, and have sort of, you know, for the reasons that we talked about earlier in the interview, but also, reasons about around culture clash in the 60s between, hippie long hairs and traditional blue collar, union types.
And the
There,
racial dynamics of rock and roll to a certain extent, I think also.
yeah, to some, I think that's probably a little more localized. Um, again, like I don't want to get too in the weeds on this
No,
necessarily,
no, no.
but at least with the AFM, like there's a real distinction between the AFM as a national institution that's engaged, I think newly engaged now with being part at the table in legislative conversations,
Hmm.
um, and the
And the
locals
locals.
and the
Yeah.
locals who are much more provincial, and some of whom disbanded their organizing units completely, are just not we're not actively expanding. I think the New York local 802 didn't have organizers for a couple of years.
That's always
Um,
good. It's always good to just stop or
yeah,
it's always a sign of a vital institution.
that's right. And you'll find, people who are coming up through jazz will have some overlap with the unions. People who are
Right.
coming up through rock tend not to. Maybe your first time you sign a union contract would be like the first time you played Conan O'Brien or something like that.
Right. Right.
A late night show. But there are some of the locals who are, like, there's also new energy there in a really interesting way. Like the Portland, Oregon local has this initiative that they're calling fair trade venues, that they're trying to get venues to sign up to adhere
Oh,
to a
cool.
certain level, in the same way that you would try to get fair trade certification on your products, so that venues will guarantee certain working conditions and, certain minimums for opening acts and stuff like that, and also but that also has the effect of bringing those bands and those musicians under the union umbrella. The Nashville local is doing something similar with home recording, so that as all the recording sessions, and especially the demo sessions, which used to provide a lot of bread and butter for Nashville session musicians, as that moves
Hmm.
out of the unionized studios into people's unregulated home recording situations, that's a real existential threat to the Nashville local and to the musicians who are pulled between these two competing incentives, right? Of the security of the union, which provides them health care and pensions and all this other advantages, and the work itself, which is moving into these unregulated home spaces. So the Nashville local is providing a scale that now includes different levels of home recording at affordable
Huh.
rates, not the hundreds of dollars for 3 hour session, but maybe, the $50 or the $100 that you might already get, which has the advantage for the musicians and the union of keeping everyone still in the umbrella. And so it
Yeah.
seems to me that there's a way that there needs to be a reconciliation between these upstart groups on the rock side and a kind of innovative attitude on the union local side. Because you read these articles about, Chapel Rowan talks about why don't labels offer health insurance? And that's a good point. And people write these articles about it. But it's like, there is this extant institution which offers health insurance and pensions to musicians. And it's a little bit up to, and instead of, rock band people going around bemoaning, saying like, why are we, there is an opportunity there to sort of bring your institution under this existing umbrella, both on the label side as the employer, indie labels, especially indie labels who are operating at a
Yeah.
scale that would have been considered a major in the 60s and 70s, your merges and
Domino
uh,
and yeah.
uh, sub pops and so on, are not signatories to the
And
to the union contracts, and they could be. And all of a sudden, all these, then you have access to health insurance. You're paying into the pensions. There are ways to do this within the existing structures.
yeah, no, that's really interesting. And it's interesting to think about ways in which this could help ameliorate, it's because it's all about points of leverage, right? That's the key of unionization. And
Yes,
like an
yes,
individual
of course.
artist, very little point of leverage against anything that's kind of like digitally scaled. Like anything that's like on all the platforms. Like you're not
Yes,
gonna Taylor Swift couldn't get
yes,
Spotify to do much of anything, at least for everyone else. We don't know whatever deal she cut when she came back on the platform. But like that's a hard road to follow. But saying like we're going to pressure these venues and then everyone should go to this venue, not that venue, you do have some leverage.
yes. I mean, the problem with lumping like anti-Spotify activism or like raise streaming royalties activism into this question is that, of course, that's not a labor issue. That's a royalty issue. It's not about wages and working conditions. But the musicians union does have can have a seat at the table for legislation because they're at that scale in a way that small musicians, activist groups of a couple dozen people cannot,
Yeah.
and can only propose sort of these online, like shaming.
Yes.
Like you're not going to shame Spotify with a
No,
with
they
a
have no
hashtag.
shame. They've established that.
um, so to align yourself with a large institutional organization, there's like working conditions questions around health insurance and pensions and maybe pay at venues that are that can be action items for a union local in the way that you're talking about. And then the larger things about AI, you know the AFM is interested in AI, right? Because historically AI is in keeping with these technologies that replace
Musicians, yeah.
musicians jobs. Like they have 100 years of experience with that fight. um
Right.
but these things, there's now I'm forgetting the congresswoman from North Carolina who has a bill on about that would enable musicians to organize without being considered,
Oh, I don't know about this,
like
I don't
organize.
think.
It's not the Tlaib one that got much more publicized, but it's I think possibly a much more effective one, because the problem is, say you organize 1,000 musicians to pull their catalogs from Spotify as a boycott, um, because of
Yeah,
Taft-Hartley,
no, I was saying
that
that
would
I
be
don't think, yeah,
considered.
that's illegal.
It's an illegal cartel, right? And that's the problem with all this sort of activism, and that happens. That's not an idle threat.
No, I know.
This
Yeah.
and so this congresswoman has introduced a bill that would close that loophole. And so there's a way in which I think, on the national front, focusing on that bill instead of this sort of message bill that Tlaib has put forward, it would be is a real could be a really constructive step forward. And another reason for musicians to look into what they can do on with these organizations that are really operating in Washington.
No, that makes a ton of sense. And no, and the reason I think that it I kind of connected it to the Spotify level is just that, people have limited amounts of energy. And the question
Yeah.
is jousting at not windmills, but actual giants, the best use of people's limited energy between 4 gigs and, all the other parts of a working musician's life that you lay out in the book.
Right. You have to engage in a kind of triage, right? And I'm not obviously like streaming royalties are an existential crisis. I'm not saying they're not. They definitely are. If in terms of you used to be able to sell the widget with your music on it, and now you can't, right? As an income stream. However, I think two things. One is that it's not unprecedented, right? Musicians have faced equivalent crises in the past, going back to the player piano, and records themselves.
Right.
But also that you can conceive of that battle, which is going to take a long time and might not be resolved even by the time streaming is replaced by the next technology, while also thinking about the sort of day-to-day individual existential questions of healthcare and retirement, and can I get paid $100 to play first of three at such and such a venue? And those are the sort of localized things that can be addressed within your working lifetime.
And I think not for nothing. I mean, I think one of the things that was powerful, I think, for a lot of folks was seeing the Hollywood strikes. Where like, oh shit, like clearly it's a very different industry, but like some industries like have really
a functioning
unions, and it does seem like going 0 to 100 isn't possible. You can start focusing on specific limit, getting rid of merch cuts in venues, or
yes,
like specific bread and butter limited things, and then everyone, if people are part of a successful campaign, then you've got a whole bunch more people who have been part of a successful campaign, and you can go on to try something a little bit more ambitious, maybe.
That's right. You have a proof of concept, and that is the sort of like your local venue is susceptible to shaming in a way that a
Right.
billionaire in Sweden is not. Your local venue that had that the 300 to 500 cap, you can, or the local indie label, like there's I understand it gets complicated because of this history of thinking about the label, the venue, and the acts as partners in a communal ecosystem, as opposed to the adversarial relationship that often comes with collective action. And that is a problem.
Yeah.
But it's not an insoluble problem. And so this is another one of those things where, here's what are another one of the issues that you hear people talk about: corporate consolidation of venues, right? Like my town doesn't have an independent venue anymore. Okay, but what you do have now is a unified corporate adversary. And those are all this. If you have a unitary adversary, then you have leverage. Then it's much the relationship is much more clear. It is clarified.
Right. And one that could pay more money potentially, which like your struggling local bar and venue might not be able to pay a lot more money,
and is used to dealing with collectivized labor, probably in another sector of their business.
Yeah,
like you're the sucker in a way for not taking advantage of
no
that.
I mean, yeah.
If right. Your local corporate consolidated venue owner is probably dealing with unionized electricians.
Yeah. No, I mean, that was the crazy thing. I mean, back to vaudeville, the stagehands union was always strong.
Yes.
The vaudevillain, the white rats get crushed. no one messes with the stagehands because you can always draft another someone to try to come juggle. But like, if the stagehands are on strike, it's very
Yes.
difficult to get past them.
Yeah. And one of the problems with I mean, now we're deep in the weeds in this, but one of the first, when they replaced um when they were replacing the pit orchestras in the 20s and 30s at the movies,
Yeah.
right, with recorded sound in movies, and the AFM tried to strike the theaters. The other unions crossed the picket lines because they wanted to go see the movies, and they didn't recognize the musicians really as workers in the same way that they were, right? Because musicians are always in this sort of are not always sure themselves whether they want to be considered, workers, or whether they want to be considered artists.
Yeah. That was also my understanding is also there's this is really deep in the weeds. This is also like the publishers who have relationships to the music union were able to do like the pre-consent decree knee breaking ASCAP stuff to the theaters. So they were also in favor, like they didn't want the revenue stream to dry up and were able to do like we heard one of our songs. We're not telling you which one. So there
Well,
was
it's a different category too. You're protecting the songwriters as opposed to protecting the players in the
right.
orchestra. Like it's different
No,
organizations.
I know, but just that in in the music industry that there were major organized interests in the union industry that had kind of opposite non-corporate. Yeah,
Yes, I see what you're saying. Like once the songwriters are protected, then they're
yeah,
done. They're done with it because their song is in the score. And because recording, off all of a sudden, on the one hand, it takes away from live musicians. On the other hand, it creates a new class of session musicians that can be like it gets complicated, but it's not that complicated. Like, there is an aspect to the sort of like the way in which the class assumptions of musicians shifting from blue collar to middle class has
hmm
created a class of musicians, I think, who are, what's the best way to say this? When you read biographies of Petrillo, who was the famous AFM leader in the mid-century, he got his start organizing musicians in Chinese restaurants in mob-controlled Chicago. It wasn't polite or pretty. And I find, it's a little hard to imagine, 2025
yeah,
indie rockers being comfortable with that kind of organizing.
yeah. I know you write about this in the book about how there's less willingness to, and it's to talk about money and or changed willingness to talk about money. And some of this is, I think about like cultural capital versus capital stuff that like if you
Yes,
could
yes,
potentially have gone to med school and instead you've chosen to be a musician, like you've already made a
yes.
decision at some level. Maybe med school, but like if peers in your, general peers have gone to med school and you've decided to be a musician, you've already chosen to not prioritize. You've chosen to prioritize one kind of capital over another.
Yes, and that is the appeal of going into rock and roll in the 21st century. It's not financial capital. It's
No,
because
it's
it's because you'll be cool. You think you'll be cool. And so it becomes a question about like which is the actual priority in the long term.
and how to build lives around potentially even both.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, we've gone so far over now. I'm
Well,
sorry. I apologize to your editing time.
no. Thank you so much. I really encourage everyone who's interested in music and how it gets made to read this book. Friends, thank you so much, both for this and for being a band person in so many ways yourself.
Yeah.
um,
Well, thank you for asking me to do this. This was a ton of fun.
Amazing. Thank you.